Meredith Whitmore boarded first class with the confidence of a woman who always got her way. Luxury was her birthright, exclusivity her expectation. But when she spotted a man in a crisp suit seated beside her, irritation flickered across her face. Something felt off. A glance, a whisper, a carefully chosen complaint. She believed a few words could fix this mistake. She had no idea she was seconds away from the most humiliating moment of her life, and the entire world was about to watch. The steady hum of conversations and rolling luggage filled Atlanta Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport, the busiest travel hub in America. The first-class check-in line was orderly, filled with executives, socialites, and seasoned travelers who expected nothing less than perfection. Meredith Whitmore, a well-known philanthropist's wife and an elite socialite, stood near the front, her designer handbag balanced on her wrist. She had spent years cultivating an image of class, exclusivity, and prestige. Flying first class was not just a preference, it was her expectation. With her husband's wealth and her long-standing connections in high society, she had never experienced inconvenience. As she adjusted her silk scarf, she noticed a man ahead of her in line. Tall, well-dressed, with a confident yet composed presence. Something about him felt out of place. Her lips pursed slightly. The man, Xavier Cole, moved forward in line, presenting his boarding pass and ID with effortless ease. He wore a tailored blazer, carried a sleek laptop bag, and exuded an air of quiet authority. Meredith scoffed softly, shaking her head as she took a step forward. He must be in the wrong line. Then, Xavier reached for his first-class boarding pass and handed it to the gate agent. Meredith's eyebrows lifted. When the agent nodded and waved him through, a flicker of irritation flashed across her face. Meredith leaned toward the woman beside her, voice low yet pointed. Interesting. You'd think they'd be more selective about who they let in first class these days. Meredith Whitmore glided through the first-class jet bridge, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The moment she stepped into the cabin, she inhaled deeply, savoring the familiar luxury. The plush leather seats, the subtle scent of premium champagne, the quiet murmur of well-dressed passengers settling in. This was her world, a space reserved for people like her. She adjusted her designer blazer and turned toward seat 2A, expecting an empty space beside her, maybe a familiar face from one of her charity events. Instead, she froze mid-step. There he was, the same man from the first-class check-in line, Xavier Cole, already seated in 2B, his laptop open, his attention locked onto the screen, as if he belonged there. Meredith felt her throat tighten. This couldn't be right. She double-checked the seat number on her boarding pass. 2A. Her seat. She set her designer tote down with a little too much force, just enough to make her presence known. No reaction. Meredith took her seat, adjusting her posture with a stiff elegance, her movements calculated, controlled. She stole a glance at him, expecting a flustered reaction. A glance, an awkward shift, an apology. Nothing. Xavier continued typing, unbothered, as if she were invisible. The glow from his laptop screen illuminated the sharp angles of his face, the confidence in his posture. Meredith pursed her lips, exhaling sharply through her nose. She glanced around, expecting to see a flight attendant approach at any moment, perhaps discreetly asking the man to relocate due to some unfortunate booking mix-up. Instead, all she saw were other passengers settling into their seats, the flight crew preparing for takeoff. Her fingers tapped lightly against the armrest. She couldn't let this sit. Clearing her throat delicately, she turned slightly toward Xavier, feigning a polite smile. "Excuse me," she said, voice carefully measured. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Without pausing his typing, Xavier gave a brief nod. "Yes." That was it. No elaboration, no explanation. Meredith blinked, annoyance prickled at her skin. She swallowed back the frustration, offering another forced chuckle, tilting her head slightly as if humoring a mistake. She gestured vaguely between their seats. I assumed there had been some kind of mix-up. Xavier didn't even glance up. Meredith felt her patience wearing thin. This wasn't how things were supposed to work. In her world, people like Xavier didn't belong here. They worked for the airline, catered to first-class passengers. Or maybe, they got lucky with a last-minute upgrade. But they didn't just sit there like they owned the place. Her fingers tightened around the edge of her armrest. Number. This was unacceptable. She pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded overhead. The flight attendant, Chloe Martinez, approached with a professional yet warm smile. "Is everything all right, ma'am?" Meredith smiled tightly, keeping her voice low, as if she were discussing something delicate. "I think there's been a little mistake. I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Chloe turned to Xavier, who finally paused his typing, looking up for the first time. His expression? Unreadable. Calm. Unshaken. Chloe pulled up the passenger manifest on her tablet. After a quick scan, she looked back up. "Actually, Mr. Cole is in his correct seat," she said politely. "You're in 2A, and he's in 2B, as assigned." Meredith's stomach clenched. Her smile barely wavered, but she could feel the weight of passengers watching now. Subtle glances from across the aisle, the faint murmur of conversation. She let out a breathy chuckle, shaking her head slightly. "That's odd," she murmured, as if the airline itself had made a glaring mistake. Chloe remained professional, her patience unwavering. "I assure you, everything is correct, ma'am." Meredith swallowed the bitter taste rising in her throat. She was losing control of the situation. She turned back toward the window, her jaw tightening, her grip on the armrest firm. She could feel the stares now. She wasn't used to this. Being questioned. Being dismissed. Being ignored. Number, she wasn't going to let this slide. This wasn't over. Meredith Whitmore sat rigidly in seat 2A, her fingers tightening around the armrest, as the flight attendant, Chloe, walked away. She could still feel the lingering stares of the other passengers, some subtle, others not so much. A young woman across the aisle casually adjusted her phone, the lens angled ever so slightly in Meredith's direction. She forced herself to breathe, to smooth the tension from her expression. This was unacceptable. The man, Xavier Cole, sat beside her as if he belonged, as if he had every right to be here. He wasn't flustered, wasn't apologetic, wasn't explaining himself. That only made it worse. Meredith prided herself on being able to read people, control situations. And yet, here she was, feeling utterly powerless in her own space. She exhaled sharply and pressed the call button again. The soft chime barely had time to fade before Chloe reappeared, her expression still polite, but now tinged with something else. Mild impatience. "Is there something else I can do for you, ma'am?" Meredith leaned in slightly, lowering her voice just enough to feign discretion. "I'd like to request a seat change," she said smoothly, her tone carefully controlled. Chloe blinked, as if processing the request carefully. "Are you uncomfortable? Is there an issue with the seat itself?" Meredith hesitated. She couldn't say what she was really thinking. She couldn't outright state that she didn't want to sit next to a black man in first class. No, she had to be more strategic. She tilted her head toward Xavier, then lowered her voice further. I don't feel comfortable," she said, her words slow, deliberate, heavy with unspoken meaning. Xavier paused his typing. For the first time, he acknowledged her fully, turning his head slightly, his sharp gaze meeting hers. His expression remained unreadable, but something in his eyes held weight, held knowledge. A beat passed, then another. Chloe's professional smile faltered just slightly. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am," she said carefully. "Let me check if there are any available seats." Meredith sat back, lips pressed together in triumph. Finally, she was getting somewhere. Chloe tapped quickly on her tablet. The murmurs from other passengers had quieted, but Meredith could still feel the tension in the air. After a moment, Chloe sighed softly. "I'm afraid first class is at full capacity," she said with a hint of finality. "There aren't any open seats available," Meredith's stomach clenched. That wasn't the answer she wanted. She adjusted the silk scarf around her neck, her voice cooling. And in economy? A flicker of something crossed Chloe's face, a realization, a shift. She hesitated. Then, her voice even, controlled, she answered. There are 2 open seats in economy. Meredith straightened her posture, composing herself. Perfect, she said. He can take one of them. A ripple of murmur spread through the cabin. Across the aisle, the young woman with the phone tilted her camera up just slightly. A businessman in seat 3C chuckled under his breath. Chloe's smile didn't return. She stood a little straighter, squared her shoulders. Ma'am, she said, her tone no longer light, no longer accommodating. Just to clarify, you want me to move Mr. Cole to economy because you don't want to sit next to him? Meredith's lips parted slightly. A brief flicker of panic crossed her face. She wasn't used to being challenged this directly, but she was too deep in now. She tilted her chin up slightly, keeping her voice calm, controlled. I don't see why that's such an issue, she said smoothly. Passengers request seat changes all the time. I'm simply asking for the same courtesy. Perfect, she said. He can take one of them. A ripple of murmur spread through the cabin. Across the aisle, the young woman with the phone tilted her camera up just slightly. A businessman in seat 3C chuckled under his breath. Chloe's smile didn't return. She stood a little straighter, squared her shoulders. Ma'am, she said, her tone no longer light, no longer accommodating. Just to clarify, you want me to move Mr. Cole to economy because you don't want to sit next to him? Meredith's lips parted slightly. A brief flicker of panic crossed her face. She wasn't used to being challenged this directly, but she was too deep in now. She tilted her chin up slightly, keeping her voice calm, controlled. I don't see why that's such an issue, she said smoothly. Passengers request seat changes all the time. I'm simply asking for the same courtesy. Meredith Whitmore's face burned as the flight attendant, Chloe, stood firm. No, ma'am. That is not a courtesy. That is discrimination. The words hung heavy in the air, undeniable, irreversible. The quiet murmur of first-class passengers had shifted into something sharper. Judgment, recognition, quiet amusement. Meredith's jaw tightened. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was humiliation. And she wasn't the kind of woman who accepted humiliation lightly. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly scanned the cabin. A businessman pretended to scroll on his phone, but the slight smirk on his face said he had heard everything. The young woman in 3D was still recording, her phone positioned just low enough to remain unnoticed by flight attendants. And Xavier Cole? Still silent, still unbothered, still acting as though she wasn't even worth his energy. That made it worse. Her breath came faster, shallower. She wasn't used to being ignored, dismissed, looked at like she was the problem. She had to fix this, had to take back control. With one deep, deliberate inhale, Meredith sat up straighter and pressed the call button again. A soft chime. Chloe, still standing beside her, exhaled slowly before stepping forward once more. Yes, ma'am. Meredith lowered her voice, leaning in slightly. I need to speak to the head flight attendant or the pilot, she said, her words calm but edged with urgency. Chloe's expression didn't change, but her posture stiffened slightly. Ma'am, the pilot is preparing for takeoff and won't be available. But I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. I can assist you. Meredith shook her head. No, I need someone with real authority. This is a safety issue. A hush settled over the cabin. Across the aisle, the businessman let out a low chuckle. Oh, here we go, he muttered. Meredith ignored him, keeping her voice measured, controlled. I don't feel safe, she said carefully. Chloe's smile vanished. Her body language shifted completely. Rigid, alert. Xavier paused his typing again. He didn't react immediately, didn't sigh or roll his eyes or shake his head. Instead, he simply closed his laptop. Slowly, deliberately. Then, for the first time since she boarded the plane, he turned fully toward her. Their eyes met. For the first time, Meredith felt a flicker of doubt. Xavier held her gaze, his expression unreadable. Then, with an exhale so quiet it was almost dismissive, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a badge, a gold, gleaming FBI badge. Meredith Whitmore felt her entire body go rigid. The cabin, once buzzing with quiet murmurs and rustling luggage, had fallen completely silent. Passengers stared openly now. The businessman in 3C smirked, crossing his arms as if settling in for a show. The young woman in 3D subtly adjusted her phone, ensuring the recording continued. And Xavier Cole, calm, unbothered, unshaken. His FBI badge glinted under the cabin lights, the gold unmistakable. Meredith's breath hitched in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She had expected him to fidget, to explain himself, to react the way she was used to people reacting when she made them feel unwelcome. Instead, he simply held up the badge for everyone to see, tilting his head slightly as if assessing her. "Ma'am," Xavier said, his voice smooth, calm but firm. "Would you like to file an official complaint? I can take your statement right now." Meredith's mouth opened, then closed. For the first time in a long time, she didn't know what to say. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she glanced around the cabin, searching for an ally, a flight attendant, someone, anyone, who might step in and take her side. But there was no sympathy in the faces around her. Even Chloe, the flight attendant, had taken a half-step back, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Xavier was still waiting. No anger, no smugness, no aggression, just complete, absolute control. Meredith swallowed hard, the weight of the moment crushing down on her. She had thought she was in control, but this wasn't how it was supposed to go. Her voice wavered when she finally spoke. She started, then stopped. What could she say? She had made a public claim that she didn't feel safe. But now, sitting next to an FBI agent, that claim was dangerous, potentially even criminal. And everyone in the cabin knew it. A middle-aged man across the aisle snorted. "Well, that backfired," he muttered. Laughter rippled through the cabin, low but unmistakable. Meredith's face flushed hot, her hands clenched in her lap. "No," she croaked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No complaint." Xavier didn't react, didn't smirk, didn't gloat. Just nodded once, as if he had expected that answer all along. Then, just as calmly as before, he closed his badge, tucked it back into his jacket, and reopened his laptop. And just like that, he was done with her. The moment should have ended there. But it didn't, because Meredith wasn't just embarrassed. She was about to face real consequences. Meredith Whitmore sat frozen in seat 2A, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. She could still hear the soft chuckles from across the aisle, the rustle of passengers shifting in their seats as they pretended not to stare. But they were staring. Her humiliation was thick, suffocating. Xavier Cole had already moved on, his badge tucked away, his attention back on his laptop. But Meredith? She could feel the weight of every glance, every whisper, every unseen camera lens capturing her downfall in real time. Her phone vibrated in her purse, once, twice, then again. A rapid, insistent buzz. She hesitated, heart pounding, before slowly reaching into her designer tote and pulling it out. Her stomach dropped. The screen was already flooded with notifications, text messages, missed calls, news alerts. Her fingers trembled as she unlocked her phone, opening her messaging app. A message from an acquaintance. "Meredith, is this you? Tell me this isn't real." Another from a former friend. Wow, you just had to pull a Karen moment, didn't you? Have fun dealing with this mess. Then, her worst fear realized. A forwarded link to Twitter. She clicked on it, her breath catching in her throat. The video was already online, and it was spreading. Fast. The caption? Rich lady tries to remove a black man from first class, then learns he's FBI. 94,000 views. Meredith felt the blood drain from her face. She scrolled down, comment after comment. She really thought she was going to get away with it. That FBI badge came out, and suddenly she lost her voice. Instant karma is a beautiful thing. Her heart pounded against her ribs. This wasn't just a bad moment. This was her reputation unraveling in real time, and the flight hadn't even landed yet. She turned her phone face down on the tray table, pressing her fingers against her temples. This couldn't be happening. But it was. And it was only getting worse. Meredith Whitmore's hands trembled as she gripped her phone, staring at the rapidly climbing view count on the viral video. 112,000 views. She refreshed. 145,000. It was spreading faster than she could comprehend. Her name, her full name, was trending. Her phone buzzed again, vibrating so violently against the tray table that a few nearby passengers glanced over. She snatched it up, unlocking it with a frantic swipe. A new message from her husband's executive assistant. Mrs. Whitmore, we need to discuss the situation immediately. The company has been contacted for comment. Her throat went dry. Another message from her publicist. Do not say anything. Do not respond. We need to control this before it gets worse. But it was already too late. A news alert popped up at the top of her screen. Viral video. Socialite tries to have FBI agent removed from first class. Backlash grows. Meredith felt sick. This wasn't supposed to happen. This wasn't supposed to happen. She glanced around the cabin, praying that maybe no one else had seen it yet. But across the aisle, the businessman who had chuckled earlier, now he was openly laughing. The young woman in 3D, still recording. And Xavier Cole, still typing. Still unbothered. Meredith pressed her lips together, swallowing down the humiliation clawing at her throat. She needed to fix this. Maybe if she explained herself. Maybe if she told them it was all a misunderstanding. But as she reached for the call button again, Chloe, the flight attendant, appeared beside her seat, this time unsmiling. Ma'am, she said quietly but firmly. We're about to begin our descent into Washington, D.C. I need to confirm that you will remain seated and will not cause any further disruption. Meredith froze. She had been dismissed, just like that. She opened her mouth to argue, but Chloe's expression was final. Passengers watched, waiting. The pressure was crushing. Slowly, Meredith nodded, folding her hands in her lap. Chloe didn't move for a second. Then, satisfied, she turned and walked away. The flight was almost over. But for Meredith, her nightmare was just beginning. As soon as the plane landed at Reagan National Airport, Meredith Whitmore practically bolted from her seat, her hands gripping her designer tote like a lifeline. She needed to get out. Quickly. But as she stepped into the terminal, her breath caught in her throat. A small crowd had gathered near baggage claim. Reporters, cameras, microphones. One of them locked eyes with her. That's her. Meredith spun on her heel, heart hammering. Her phone buzzed. Another text from her husband's company. We need your resignation by morning. Her stomach lurched. Her world, her reputation, her privilege, her control was crumbling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Meanwhile, at a nearby airport cafe, Xavier Cole sipped his coffee, scrolling through his phone. When asked later about the incident, he only shrugged. Oh, that? Just another Tuesday. Meredith Whitmore's downfall wasn't just about one moment. It was about entitlement, bias, and the illusion of control. In today's world, where every action can be recorded and shared in seconds, True character is revealed when no one expects to be watched. This story isn't just fiction. It's a reflection of real consequences in an era of accountability. Respect, humility, and fairness matter more than privilege. So, next time you step into any space, ask yourself, are you treating others with the dignity they deserve? If you enjoy powerful, eye-opening stories like this, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Stay tuned for more stories that challenge, inspire, and reveal the truth about human nature.